Hello, BookTube. We're going to continue on with the third bookcase, which is primarily maritime. Some exploration stuff in it also. The first shelf of that third bookcase, the second part of that first bookshelf. They on that shelf they tend to be a little random. It's just because of the size of the books and how they fit in the shelf. Sometimes the logic's a little hard to follow, but we'll continue on here. The first book I want to look at is Latitude Zero, Tales of the Equator. Gianni Guadalupe, who was the co-author of the Dictionary of Imaginary Places, which I have on another shelf, with Alberto Manguel. A lot of readers know who he is. And the other author on this is Anthony Sugar. Pretty cover. Let's see here. Carroll and Graf Publishers, New York. 2001. There's the title page. Farther and longer than any other measure on Earth, the equator extends 24,000 miles. In a great circle, it crosses the Ecuadorian Andes and the mist-shrouded Ruwenzori Mountains, runs along the courses of both the Amazon and the Congo River, cuts through Africa's mighty Lake Victoria, as well as to the coral atolls and volcanic hulks of Krakatoa and the blue waters of the Indian Ocean. Yet the equator is a wholly imaginary construct, a human idea that has fascinated and challenged explorers for 3,000 years. From the ancient Egyptian spice traders in search of the legendary lands of Punt and Ophir, to the 16th century Portuguese who sought a route to the Indies, to the South Sea voyages of the Victorian novelist Robert Louis Stevenson, for whom the fearsome King Tembanock built at Latitude Zero in the Gilbert Islands an enclave named Equator City. The equator, its location not only on the globe, but in the minds and exploits of navigators, travelers, poets, madmen, and dreamers since the dawn of civilization, is the thread on which the eminent Italian historian Gianni Guadalupe and Anthony Sugar string some of the humankind's most intriguing lore and most amazing adventures in this engaging volume of intellectual history. I wonder if they have pictures of the... No, they don't have pictures of the authors, but this is a good little book. So it'd be a good source book for a novelist or a poet. So moving right along to something a little more dry, but if you like the ocean and you like ships in the sea, it's a book to have. It was one of the Von Nostrand, I doubt you can see it there, maybe you can, nautical manuals, and this is Knight's Modern Seamanship, familiar to any professional sailor. A little beat up. This is the 10th edition. It was revised in 1941. It's Modern Seamanship by Austin M. Knight. This is the 10th edition, rewritten and revised by the officers of the Department of the Seamanship and Navigation, United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. It was published in New York by D. Von Nostrand Incorporated. The first edition of this came out in 1901, and this one is copyright 1937, but it's reprinted with changes and revisions in October 1942. So let's see what they got for a title. This is the handbook if you're on a modern ship. A modern ship then would look like that. And don't forget this is World War II. So this is the USS Ranger, an aircraft carrier. We have the USS Dewey, a destroyer. And this is a sort of, so this is a section through a rudder stop. So if you're a sailor on a Coast Guard or Navy ship, or even on a merchant vessel, this would probably be your library. I mean, these are the lights to help prevent collision at sea. Probably not a good thing to have on when enemy aircraft are operating. This is how to run the lines to a dot. So you also have to understand the weather. So these are all things that would be in a professional sailor's bookshelf. The next one here, beautiful cover is John Steele Gordon, The Heroic Story of the Transatlantic Cable, and the title is A Thread Across the Ocean. The Civil War had barely ended, however, when the old and new worlds had been united by the successful laying of a telegraph cable that spanned the Atlantic Ocean in 1866. A Thread Across the Ocean chronicles this extraordinary achievement, one of the greatest engineering feats of that century, and perhaps of all time. It was an epic struggle, requiring a decade of effort, numerous failed attempts, millions of dollars in capital, a near disaster at sea, the overcoming of seemingly insurmountable technological problems, many of them entirely unforeseen before work commenced, and uncommon physical, financial, and intellectual courage. In the end, it literally changed the world. So John Steele Gordon is the author of The Business of America, The Great Game, Hamilton's Blessing, The Extraordinary Life and Times of Our National Debt, and The Scarlet Woman of Wall Street. He writes a regular column, The Business of America, for American Heritage Magazine. Interesting story. So our next book is about whaling. Now, our perceptions of whaling, rightfully so, have changed over the years. But that doesn't take anything away from the fact that it was a dangerous business. This is Of Whales and Men by R.B. Robertson, New York, Alfred A. Knopf, 1954. This is a Borzoi book. Inside, there's one of these little Book of the Month Club pamphlets. Because this is missing its dust jacket, it's sort of a handy little thing to have. And this is a report by Clifton Fadiman. For me, this book brought news from a completely strange world. For some years ago, Dr. Robertson, a Scottish surgeon and psychiatrist, spent 8 months as senior medical officer of a large whaling fleet in the South Atlantic. He had 650 Scottish and Norwegian whalemen under his care, voyaged 48,000 miles through the world's most desolate waterways, and returned to write a book whose true forebear is not so much Moby Dick as 2 years before the mast. Time will inform us as to whether it, like Dana's masterpiece, is a genuine classic of the sea. But it seems to have the something of the smack and savor of one. Of course, one thing that comes to mind in our time is if these guys are, where they're sailing in the South Atlantic, what does that look like now compared to what it looked like then? I mean, there's been a lot of changes. So that's what a whaling ship, the deck of one, looks like. Here's the fleet. These were large-scale operations. So interesting part of history there. Let's see if I do this without knocking these all over on myself. This next non-dust jacketed volume is The Sea Chest. And this is great. This is a bookplate individual had done for the book. Probably costs a lot of money to do this now. Ex Libris Nauticus. So it's from his nautical library of John E. Nicholson. Look at the size of that bookplate. It's pretty neat. This is called The Sea Chest, a Yachtsman's Reader. Edited by Critchell Remington, managing editor of Yachting Magazine, W.W. Norton Company, Incorporated, New York, 1947. And it's a collection of pieces. Some of them quite good. Let's see what we have here. I'll just The Wreck of the Simba by Richard Morey. Um, Here's a name from the literary past. Off the Deep End by Christopher Morley. Let's see. The Sailor Takes a Wife, Alfred Stanford. Cutters and Others by L. Francis Herreshoff. It's a big name in boat design. The Strength of the Wind Sea by Gardner Emmons. Let's see if anything you know. Man Overboard by Chester Bowles. Ordeal by Neville Shute. Let's see here. 40,000 Miles in a Canoe by Captain J.C. Voss. So, and a lot more. Just read a few examples. And then here's a great little book. This is a reprint. I remember when it first came out. This is the Brendan Voyage by Tim Severin. This one's introduced by Malachi McCourt, and the series editor is John Krakauer. This is the Modern Library of Exploration. I read this back when it first came out in a hardback. So, originally published in 1978 by McGraw-Hill Incorporated. And that was a beautiful edition, much nicer than this. It had better photos and all that. I'd like to run into that again. Anything by Tim Severin I liked anyway. He was sort of a historian, explorer, adventurer. So this tells the story of, and that's where the missing. I don't know if they reproduce the photos at all. They do have a map. Basically, the author makes a leather boat based on the boats that are made in Ireland. And the story of how they did that is fascinating. And they sailed it from Ireland to Iceland in this little section. Let's see what's from Iceland to Newfoundland. And then I believe it ended up in. See if they get any more maps. So basically, they get to. I think the boat's in Massachusetts now, but this is what it looked like. If you can find the hardcover first edition or the hardcover edition, doesn't have to be first printing or anything like that. The images are better than they are in here, but this is good to have. It's a great story. Basically, there's a whole literature like that. Kon-Tiki by Thor Heyerdahl, where you reconstruct a historic type of craft as best you can. Sometimes we don't have all the information, and then you just see what it can do. Could it really do these voyages? Is it any way to confirm it was at least possible to the Pacific in a raft, or in this case, the North Atlantic in a leather boat? Inspired by the legends of St. Brendan. It's a very good book. Now, a book that's on that shelf because it's like that's where it fits, but The Autobiography of a Yankee Mariner, Christopher Prince in the American Revolution, edited by Michael Crawford. This is let's see, Brassey's Incorporated, Washington D.C., 2002. Christopher Prince, the original autobiographer, lived from 1751 to 1832. And this book is used, well, let's just read the back. A never before published and exceedingly rare participant's account of seafaring during the period of the American Revolution. Born in a seaport town in colonial Massachusetts, Christopher Prince grew up and became an accomplished merchant seaman. During the Revolution, he served on board both British and American ships. In his journal, which is the foundation of the Autobiography of a Yankee Mariner, he recounted narrow escapes from death, his travails as a prisoner, previously unknown tales about a joint Indian and British attack on Montreal, and a new perspective on Ethan Allen's imprisonment. He concluded with an account of his religious conversion and its transforming effect on his life. Historian Michael J. Crawford provides expert historical context to Prince's journal with an introduction, notes, appendices, and glossary. Prince and Crawford's combined efforts bring us a riveting real-life story that makes an important contribution to our understanding of American naval maritime revolutionary history. Then this is not a maritime book. This is Edward Beauclerk Maurice, The Last Gentleman Adventurer, Coming of Age in the Arctic. Beautiful book. Unfortunately, in this lighting, you don't really get the full effect of it. Again, nice end papers that are helpful. So, Edward Beauclerk Maurice, Last Gentleman Adventurer, Coming of Age in the Arctic, forward by Lawrence Millman, Houghton Mifflin Company, Boston, New York. Copyright 1995 to 2004, Edward Beauclerk Maurice. So this is the title page. At 16, Edward Beauclerk Maurice impulsively signed up with the Hudson Bay Company, the company, of gentlemen adventurers, and ended up at an isolated trading post in the Canadian Arctic, where there was no communication with the outside world and only one ship arrived each year. But the Inuit people who traded there taught him how to track polar bears, build igloos, survive expeditions in ferocious winter storms. He learned their language and became so immersed in their culture and way of life that children thought he was Inuit himself. When an epidemic struck, Maurice treated the sick using a simple first aid kit, and after a number of the hunters died, he had to start hunting himself, often with women, who soon began to compete for his affections. The young man, who in England had never been alone with a woman other than his mother and sisters, had come of age in the Arctic. The Last Gentleman Adventurer, Edward Beauclerk Maurice, transports the reader to a time and a way of life now lost forever. It's also an environment lost forever. After serving in the New Zealand Navy during World War II, Edward Beauclerk Maurice became a bookseller in an English village and rarely traveled again. He died in 2003, as this, his only book, was being ready for publication. Look at that picture. Isn't that great? So, very interesting. Let me see. I'll do this one next. This is another. This is a Dover book. Dover Publications. The Adventures at Sea in the Great Age of Sail. 5 first-hand narratives, so it's a collection. Captain Elliot Snow. Let's see when this was published. Oh, the introduction is Captain Elliot Snow. Dover Publications Incorporated, New York. This Dover edition, first published in '86, is an unabridged republication of the work first published by the Marine Research Society, Salem, Mass., in 1925 under the title The Sea, the Ship, and the Sailor. It's there. There. So some examples. In March 9th, 1790, I shipped on board the ship Massachusetts, Captain Job Prince, commander, bound on a voyage from Canton in China. She excited a considerable sensation, for she was the largest merchant vessel built at the time in the United States. And that begins the narrative of one John Bartlett of Boston. During the War of 1812, Charles Bernard sailed the Falkland Islands, where he rescued a shipwrecked British captain and crew, who then seized his vessel. Nice. He was abandoned to survive as best he could on an uninhabited island and lived there for 2 years, a real-life Robinson Crusoe. There's also tales that Captain John B. Knights, master of the brig Spry out of Salem, Mass., who sailed the South Pacific, where he bartered for tortoiseshell. So these are all authentic tales of seagoing action and adventures. And Dover's pretty good about stuff like that. I like some of their stuff. I don't know if they listed it in here. Oh yeah, they usually have a little list of So they'll have a section. Dover does a lot of stuff, but right there you see a list of books on travel and adventure. The next volume is The Life of Horatio Lord Nelson, and there's been many biographies of Horatio Nelson. This is by Robert Southey. It's a Barnes & Noble reprint. Kind of publication information they'll give us. This edition by Barnes & Noble Incorporated, 1993 Barnes & Noble book. It'd be nice if they told us when it originally came out. The death of Nelson was felt in England as something more than a public calamity. Men started at the intelligence and turned pale as if they had heard the loss of a dear friend. Horatio Nelson entered the British Navy at the age of 12 and became a captain at the age of 20, having advanced up the ranks so quickly and having achieved success at such an early age, he became a magnetic and controversial figure. His triumphs at Cape St. Vincent and the Nile were set beside the failures of Tenerife and Boulogne. With the glories of Copenhagen and Trafalgar still before him, his passion for Emma Hamilton, the wife of a British ambassador, cast a shadow over his career. Daring in battle, and so on. So, one of many biographies of Nelson. The last two volumes are both on the same fella. And that's Lord Cochrane. When we looked at the first bookshelf, we saw a Folio Society edition of Cochrane's autobiography. It was beautifully done. Cochrane was the model for a lot of nautical fiction heroes. So he's always fun to read about. He's the model because he was such an engaging and flamboyant character and warrior. So the first one here is Lord Cochrane, Seaman Radical Liberator. And this is by Christopher Lloyd. It's in the Heart of Oak Sea Classics. They were around for quite a while. I wish I'd picked them all up because some of these books are hard to find in print anymore. Looks like this. All the Heart of Oak Sea Classics look pretty similar. I think I have one or two others that we'll look at eventually. So this is the series editor of this is Dean King, who we've already looked at for the lexicon on the Patrick O'Brien books. So Christopher Lloyd, Lord Cochrane, Seaman Radical Liberator, A Life of Thomas, Lord Cochrane, 10th Earl of Dundonald. Heart of Oak Sea Classics, Dean King series editor, forward by Dean King, an introduction by John B. Hattendorf, an Owl book, Henry Holt and Company, New York. And this book originally came out in 1947, but let's see what the... so this is 1998. There's a reprint. That's an image we actually saw in the Folio Society version. And the image in the Folio Society is much better. But it also costs a lot more. So Christopher Lloyd chronicles the true life of the fighting captain whose bold career inspired the fiction of Marryat, Forrester, and O'Brien. The controversial Thomas Cochrane, known to many as the Sea Wolf, is second only to Nelson himself among the heroes and legends of the Royal Navy. Renowned for his daring, skill, and enterprise, Cochrane was much revered by his men, and remarkably enough, later went on to command ships in the navies of Chile, Brazil, Peru, and Greece, providing outstanding leadership in their struggles for freedom. As a radical member of Parliament and a staunch supporter of reform in its darkest hour, Cochrane stood on the principle rather than on practicality and constantly found himself at the center of political firestorms, which I think he probably liked. And then another Life of Cochrane, this one by Robert Harvey. Let's see if we can do it without covering everything up. And papers, really nice. Now this is the title page. So, Cochrane, Life and Exploits of a Fighting Captain, Robert Harvey, Carroll and Graff Publishers Incorporated, New York. This edition's 2000. The life and adventures of daring seaman Thomas Cochrane, who rose from midshipman to admiral and was called the Sea Wolf by Napoleon, are so extraordinary that his life is like a compelling page-turning work of fiction. In one sense, it has become so, for the novelist Patrick O'Brian, by his own admission, took Cochrane's exploits and used them as a basis for Jack Aubrey, the protagonist of his best-selling series of naval novels set during the Napoleonic War. And Robert Harvey is the author of numerous books, including The Liberators, Clive of India, and The Undefeated. He has worked for the Daily Telegraph and The Economist, and has been an MP. He lives in Shropshire. They get a little section. There's Cochrane at the top and Earl St. Vincent at the bottom there. And there's Cochrane in old age. So, yeah, if you had a taste for nautical fiction, you certainly would like to read this. This is a good book. I particularly like this one. But that finishes the first shelf of the third bookcase. Thank you, BookTube.